I've often told people that my two favourite screenplays ever written, or what I've encountered thus far, were both penned for British television. One is Nigel Neal's The Stone Tape, a genre piece of sci-fi horror, and the other Dennis Potter's Blade on the Feather, one of the most compelling and considered existentially precise dramas I have ever seen. What are the politics of boredom? That is a question I once heard Mark Fisher ask in a recorded lecture. I would highly, though it is not essential, well, actually kind of, it would be in my opinion better if one has viewed Blade on the Feather prior to having viewed this particular upload. Fortunately, you can. It has been uploaded to YouTube by someone incredibly generous. Do witness this screenplay for yourselves as Dennis Potter had intended without someone else telling you what he wrote beforehand. An incredibly bored upper-class English family, retired father, author Jason Cavendish, portrayed by Donald Pleasance, his daughter Christabel, Phoebe Nichols, and his wife, not Christabel's mother, Linda, played by Kika Markham. They lived together in an isolated rural mansion, accompanied and attended to by butler/personal secretary to Cavendish, Mr. Hill, depicted by the distinctly watchable Denholm Elliott. Jason Cavendish made his name as a renowned author of children's literature, composing formative magical experiences for his nation's youth, delivering them colourful, empowering expectations of lived existence which are apparently extinguished from adulthood, as suggested by the manifestations of the genre being relegated to the category of for children. He appears to think that he has penned a deceptive lie. His own existence, his family's, his now newly adult child's existence, is defined by boredom. This is why they permit the stay of the overly assertive, imposing presence of the brash, charming Daniel Young, Tom Conti, who is seeking Cavendish's insight for a thesis he is penning on political allegories within children's literature. What could Jason Cavendish think of politics? We hear him speak over jam rolls, pudding, and some of Mr. Hill's, some of England's finest custard, of how order and stability is the desired state of affairs. He is insistent on this. Odd for an author of children's literature to believe this. Does he want to indulge impressionable pre-adolescents prior to their disillusionment at the realistic? Does he sympathise with them? Considering his insistence that the great joys of life can be summed up with a series of sugary desserts, perhaps he is still a child in his own mind, in a way. But see, Cavendish believed in an ideal world. He really wanted to. For it was Jason Cavendish, his skeleton in the closet, while he was an educator at Cambridge, who had acted as a mole for the Soviet KGB, committed to that state's seeming secular utopianism, and so recruited students Guy Burgess, Kim Philby, and Donald MacLean to the cause also. Mr. Hill is an old friend of Cavendish's, his ideological compatriot from back in the day, whom Cavendish considers a believer in that cause to the point of some fanaticism. But what motivated Cavendish, born into the upper class, subject to the enormous privileges of the global British Empire, to align himself with an apparently worker-oriented ideology which sought the destruction of his and his family's vast opportunities? He claims that a large factor in this, a malaise which still plagues him now, which communism or a belief in communism never cured, was boredom. For Cavendish insists, not just some, but all, of the known British traitors to both Nazi Germany and Stalin's Russia were belonging to Cavendish's bored, upper-class, spoiled materialist nihilism, a patriotic England which relishes in jam rolls, puddings, and custards, spawning a generation of young anhedonics who deduced that the nation's pride was in its indulgent desserts, in materialist excess, expensive homes, eating, drinking, structured gardens, and snobbish laughs. Cavendish further claims he was born into a class that loves only what it owns, but that they don't own quite enough of it anymore. The materialistic melancholy of upper-class British life led its way to the materialistic utopian prospects of Marxist communist thinking. It promised to create a heaven on earth, acknowledging that man was a fallen creature, but that it could be corrected without a reliance on religion or upon the suffering of any other human beings. Of course, accepting this materialism further, the realities of the socialist experiments within the 20th century only ensured more so the confirmation that man was indeed a long-fallen creature. and so boredom with upper-class life, his belief that his family's love for it was delusional, led him to communist idealism, but then finally back to a belief in a rigid British conservatism, order and values, suits, money, markets and tradition, to regard socialism as poison and the aristocracy as just. This is the true way of the world. And given the disappointment which communism filled him with, why wouldn't Cavendish return to sulk within the material, and communism insisted that the material is indeed still everything, superficial comforts of the upper-class podiums? Hiding away in his mansion, sleeping in the sun by his tennis court, luscious desserts, sugary sweets and alcoholic spirits, it fills a void. Now he understands, perhaps, how his parents felt. Jason Cavendish's 2 brothers were slaughtered during the First World War, his father had died of cancer, and his mother became a victim of mental illness. Perhaps disenchanted with the imperial machine which had murdered his brothers, possibly feeling distant from an emotionally unavailable, unloving and flat affective father who would eventually pass, Cavendish slid into the communist idealism, the pro-Soviet idealism of the early 20th century. Remember, Karl Marx had originally belonged to this class also. And so this is the brutal, nihilistic truth of English history. Once it reaches an extravagant, luxurious, privileged and utterly opulent peak, the generation born into it grows skeptical of it, believing that the grass must be greener, or at least psychologically, and if not greener, more authentic, within the unpretentious cultural flexibility, so it would seem, of the working classes. And so in order to liberate, to align, to feel happy at least, to form a unity with these authentic, truer, more morally defensible, ethically pure and true, compared to the bourgeoisie, the Jason Cavendishes of that nation sought to bring about the existence of a communist state. Abandoning Christianity, dismissing cultural tradition, the history and pride for the nation, for strict socialist rigidity, a secular demand that the individual be extinguished, their ideals and loves and prospective luxuries in favour of an elevated collective, which could allow an empowerment, potentially, one would hope at least, of all individuals as they throw away love of family, values, green grass, manicured gardens, cosy architecture and strawberry jam for a ruthless insistence that the greater good, in this case the, or a, state, must come first, and so all must abandon their whims and band together in order to improve everyone, at the apparent cost of everyone's well-being, but in a bid for some equality nevertheless, as would happen. All it took for centuries of English pride to end, the collapse of a gigantic empire after 2 world wars, was really the ideological scorn which a newer generation of aristocratic hopefuls had felt toward the notion of Britain, of England, of God, King, Queen and country, and although the Soviet Union eventually poisoned itself and stopped widely believing in its professed ideology at all, defined with attempts at practical realpolitik aggression in the wake of ideological failures and shattered proclamations, the ideologues within Britain remained, determined to, not knowing of or in spite of the internal failures of the Soviet Union itself, to bring about some form of communist hegemony within an island once known to the earth as Great Britain. And they are indeed still committed, those operating within the UK, undercover as an impassioned ideologue or as a victim of old blackmail, for Cavendish eventually reveals to Daniel Young his knowledge of several Tory MPs and denizens of the upper house who are secretly loyal to the Soviet Union or to communism, committed to a cause which has nothing to do with Britain's, and essentially seeking to eventually demolish it. Cavendish reveals, now with despair, with shock, how the British have apparently finally lost, been invaded and conquered by an infectious ideology, having lost more territory, more battles, at the playing fields of Eton College than on any other acre of land this side of Vladivostok. All it took for the death of England was one generation of communist infiltration, and without having to live with the realities of the socialist-inspired Soviet Union, their ideology swelled, their commitment grew, their insistence that they can make the world better, can achieve communism in a manner that Lenin or Stalin never could, that the old nation was poisoned, that this secular utopia could create heaven on earth, justify humanity as God, and throw off religions and beliefs in anything except ourselves. But is it really believing in humanity, or believing in an ideology? A new sort of religion. Cavendish claims that the essential implication of communism that humankind can replace the value and totality, loyalty, motivation and purpose associated with old gods and religions with a belief and faith in itself, can make itself God, is still closer to his current beliefs than that of the previous religions. For he doesn't believe humanity is God, he believes it the devil, and this is still closer to a communist worldview, in truth, in his secret mind, than the beliefs that he was raised amongst. Asked then by Daniel Young why Cavendish is confessing all of this, he replies, boredom. Without struggle, without the will to survive. One being born into luxury and aristocracy, as someone like Jason Cavendish had in the early part of the 20th century during the closing days of the and the peak of the Pax Britannica era. He feels boredom. And so in an attempt to cure this boredom, more or less, essentially, if he was not bored, if him and those of his class were not bored, they never would have sought out these revolutionary ideals. They wouldn't have felt a kinship, a resonance with the communism of at that time, the Soviet Union. And so Blade on the Feather is about the end of existence. Boredom, as Mark Fisher once said, boredom, it gives one the prospect of death, just the blankness of nothing, and an existence defined by a lack of pleasure derived. And ultimately, within the communist dream, Jason Cavendish saw more boredom, and so returned to the deserts of his childhood in order to comfort his brain with any sort of positive rush it could possibly receive. Communism was this attempt to have everyone realize that the world was in fact material. It must be treated as such, not as a world which was designed by a god. But this only drove further home the nihilism of an upper class which, for a long time seemingly, hadn't taken religion very seriously, or certainly hadn't taken Christianity very seriously. Otherwise, maybe there would not have been 2 world wars. I think Blade on the Feather is one of the most brutal and confronting pieces ever written about the potential flatness of existence. Born into their utmost privilege, he feels as though that the opposite, that the ideologically diametrically opposed communist beliefs resonate with him more so. And then, still disillusioned with those, he returns to wallow in his sadness within the luxuries of that upper class he came from. It reminds me of Huxley's Bernard Marx in Brave New World. He was dissatisfied with his society. He sought to find a fulfillment within the world of the savage. The savage thought he would find fulfillment, love, and order, and peace within civilization. He did not. Both of them realized that the grass is always green on the other side, and that, as the opening quote in Antonio Di Benedetto's Zama reads, translated by S. for Allen, this is brutal. I really need to read this text, although it sounds daunting because, God, as my friend Saul stated, this is just an absolutely brutal way to open a text with this quote. And thanks again to Barrymore for recommending this. We both, so Saul phenomenally enjoyed it, as I said, and I'm sure I will when I get around to reading this. A las víctimas de la espera, to the victims of expectation. Brutal. I think that sums up Blade on the Feather for now. There's more to say about this film, really. It's so phenomenally profound, in my opinion. I would say it's my favourite screenplay ever written, along with Nigel Neal's The Stone Tape screenplay. I hope you have watched Blade on the Feather if you've gotten this far in my video. I hope you enjoyed Blade on the Feather. I hope you enjoyed my upload. And more importantly, I hope you're all well. Have the best day you possibly can. Thanks everyone for watching. Have a fantastic day, night, wherever you might be. Thanks again. Cheerio.